I was about to leave for dinner at my son's house when my longtime butler suddenly blocked the door, his voice shaking. Sir, don't go. You need to see this first. He pressed a thick brown envelope into my hands. The moment I opened it, the papers inside revealed something I never imagined about the son I had always trusted. In that instant, I realized the dinner waiting for me wasn't a family reunion. It was the beginning of something far more dangerous. Hello everyone, welcome to the story. Before we go further, please like the video, subscribe, and leave a quick comment telling me where you're watching from today. As this quiet dinner begins to unravel in ways no father expects, remember some elements in this story are fictionalized for storytelling and educational purposes. The steady hum of the market ticker stopped being a comfort the moment Silas Pemberton walked into my study without knocking. In this house, protocol's the only thing keeping the ghosts at bay, and Silas knew that better than anyone. I, Elias Thorne, a 71-year-old retired investment advisor, sat in my Victorian study, my fingers tracing the quarterly statements spread across my mahogany desk. My reading glasses perched on the bridge of my nose usually provided a clear view of portfolios, where every problem could be solved with careful analysis and disciplined rebalancing. But as the heavy oak door groaned open, the sanctuary of my study was breached. Silas Pemberton, the 67-year-old estate butler with a military bearing and eyes that missed nothing, entered with a silent urgency that made the fine hair on my neck stand up. He wasn't carrying the usual pre-dinner sherry or a message about the temperature of the roast. Instead, he held a thick manila envelope, the edges frayed as if it had been handled with desperate frequency. Forgive the intrusion, Sir Silas said, his voice dropping into a register that signaled an emergency far greater than a social faux pas. But the accounts of this house are no longer balanced in your favor. I adjusted my spectacles, the scent of old paper and leather clinging to my skin like a second life. What is this, Silas? I asked, my voice gravely articulate despite the sudden tightness in my chest. I have a dinner to attend. Julian will be here soon. He never misses a Friday. My son's visits were the only thing that kept the silence of my late wife Catherine's absence from becoming deafening. Time is the only thing we can't restore, Catherine, I whispered to the empty air before turning my full attention to the man who had served my family for 3 decades. My pen slipped from my fingers. It hit the floor with a hollow clatter. I didn't reach for it. Silas didn't apologize. He simply stepped forward and placed the envelope on my mahogany desk with a cold, heavy thud. He began to spread documents across the surface, moving with a grim efficiency that reminded me of his years in the service. He pointed to a name I had never heard, of Coastal Capital Holdings, LLC. My eyes struggled to make sense of the columns of numbers, the rapid-fire withdrawals, and the transfers to accounts in jurisdictions that didn't value transparency. Silas explained that he had been monitoring the household mail and Julian's suspicious interactions with our offshore holdings. Holdings Julian was supposed to be managing as part of his duties as the executor of the primary trust. Have you ever felt the air leave a room before the door even closed? I felt it then. The steady hum of financial markets, once a reassuring rhythm, suddenly sounded like a countdown to an impact I hadn't seen coming. Silas leaned over the desk, his finger resting on a document that made my stomach turn. He's not managing your retirement, mister. Thorne, he said, his eyes locking onto mine with a fierce protective pity. He's harvesting it. Look at the date. This was filed the day after we buried your wife. The metallic taste of fear filled my mouth, sharp and bitter. I looked at the sharp, aggressive handwriting on the forms, a script I had taught my son to master when he was a boy. It was Julian's signature, unmistakable and bold, appearing next to a stamp I didn't recognize. Liquidated. The trust that Catherine and I had built, over 40 years the safety net for our grandson Leo, the very foundation of the Oaks, was being drained into a shell company, while I was still mourning at her graveside. My hands, usually as steady as my investment philosophy, began to shake as I saw the finality of the betrayal. The man I was preparing to share a meal with, the son I thought was my anchor, had been waiting for the soil to settle on his mother's casket before he started the theft. Time was no longer a comfort. It was a witness to a crime I was only now beginning to understand. The ink on my son's signature looked fresh, but the betrayal it carried was years in the making. I stared at the manila folder, the paper feeling unnaturally heavy under my trembling palms. It wasn't just the sheer audacity of the theft that paralyzed me. It was the clinical, cold-blooded precision of the timing. As I squinted at the digital timestamps on the wire transfers, A stinging heat rose behind my eyes, a grief sharper than any I had felt at the funeral. Julian had initiated the first transfer of our grandson Leo's education trust, while the family was gathered at Catherine's wake. While I was accepting condolences and leaning on my son's shoulder for support, he was virtually picking my pockets. I reached out and touched the brass carriage clock on my desk, Catherine's 40th anniversary gift to me. Its unyielding metal was cold against my feverish skin. "I'm sorry, Catherine," I whispered, my voice a hollow rasp. I was blind to the rot in our own garden. I had promised her during those final agonizing nights in hospice that I would safeguard the future we built. Now I realized that by placing my absolute trust in our only child, I had inadvertently desecrated her memory. He used the very moments we were mourning her to pick the locks on my life. Silas Pemberton stood by the window, his military-grade posture silhouetted against the fading South Carolina sun. He remained a pillar of calculated calm, though the set of his jaw told me he was ready for a war. "The car is at the gate, sir," Silas said, his eyes never leaving the driveway. "You have exactly 4 minutes to find your mask." He turned to look at me, his gaze scanning my disheveled appearance. "Do not let him see the engineer, Mr. Thorne. Let him see the grieving old man he expects. Trust is like compound interest. Once it breaks, the whole portfolio becomes nothing more than a pile of worthless paper. My life's work, my son's integrity, the peace of my home, it had all snapped in a single afternoon." I pulled a lavender-scented handkerchief from my pocket, one that still carried the faint, ghostly trace of Catherine's perfume, and wiped the moisture from my face. The relentless ticking of the clocks in my study usually brought me peace, but now they sounded like a jury counting down the seconds to an execution. Silas was right. If I confronted Julian now, he would retreat, bury the offshore funds deeper, and hide behind a legion of lawyers. I had to play the long game. I had to be the man Julian had already cast me as, in his own mind, the fading sentimental father whose mind was as weary as his heart. "If he wants a confused old man, I will give him a masterclass in senility." I said the words tasting like copper in my mouth. I moved to the tall grandfather clock in the corner, a piece I had built with my own hands 30 years ago. I opened the waist door and triggered a secret compartment in the floor of the case, sliding the manila envelope inside. I timed the movement to the heavy swing of the pendulum. Tires crunched on gravel. The predator had arrived for his meal. The sound of Julian's expensive tires announced his presence with an arrogance that made my stomach churn. I looked into the mirror above the mantel, practicing the vacant, slightly lost expression that would be my armor for the evening. The gears were set. Now we simply had to wait for the strike. I smoothed my hair, suppressed the righteous fury that threatened to boil over, and walked toward the door. I wiped the clarity from my eyes, letting them go dull and soft, and prepared to welcome my own ruin through the front door. I didn't go to the police. I went to the one man in Charleston who knew where the Thorns kept their skeletons. The morning sun was already heavy with the humidity of the low country as I pulled my car into the narrow cobblestone alley behind Broad Street. My role as the grieving, slightly addled father had been played to perfection the night before over a dinner of braised lamb that had tasted like ash. Now the mask was gone, replaced by a cold clarity that felt as sharp as a watchmaker's lathe. I climbed the narrow stairs to the second-floor office where the air was thick with the scent of expensive cigar smoke and old leather. Robert Martinez, a 69-year-old estate lawyer with silver-rimmed glasses and a reputation for being the most discreet man in Charleston, sat behind a desk that had seen 3 generations of Thorne secrets. He didn't look up immediately. He was studying a file, his brow furrowed, in a way that made the pit in my stomach expand. When he finally noticed me, he didn't offer a greeting, only a heavy knowing silence. "Robert, tell me I'm misreading these numbers," I said, sliding the manila envelope across the polished mahogany. He sighed, the sound catching in the quiet room where the muffled Charleston traffic outside seemed to belong to another world entirely. "Elias, I've been trying to flag these discrepancies for months," he confessed, his voice weary. "I called the house, but Julian always intercepted the calls. He told me you were too distraught to talk, that you had given him full authority to consolidate the accounts for your own protection. He revealed that Julian had actually attempted to revoke my own signing authority on the secondary accounts 6 months ago, effectively making me a guest in my own financial life." Silence didn't just fall, it felt like a physical weight crushing the air out of my lungs. I reached for the coffee Robert provided, but the taste was cold and bitter, much like the reality unfolding before me. My old friend laid out the clinical blinding whiteness of the forged bank statements across the desk. The dry parchment feel of the legal documents made my skin crawl. Robert confirmed that Julian had forged power of attorney documents by leveraging a medical emergency clause he claimed was necessary due to my supposed mental decline. He showed me the systematic siphoning of $5.7 million into that ghost company, Coastal Capital Holdings, LLC. He used the fog of my mourning as his primary asset, I whispered, staring at the dates. The first $400,000 left the trust 3 hours after the funeral service ended. I could almost picture him stepping away from the reception to make a phone call, while I was still clutching Catherine's favorite shawl in the study. How do you quantify the price of a son's soul against a father's life? Savings. I found myself looking at the dust motes dancing in a shaft of light, wondering how many other lies were hidden in the glare. Robert tapped a pen against a ledger, his expression darkening. It's worse than simple theft, Elias. There is a phantom trail leading toward a private equity firm in Europe. Your son is a desperate man. His marina project is a total loss, bleeding cash into the harbor. If he loses the marina, he loses everything. He thinks your estate is his only life raft. I stood up the chair, scraping harshly against the floor. Then I suppose it's time to sink the boat? I replied, my voice finding a steady, icy determination I hadn't felt in decades. But Robert wasn't finished. He looked like he wanted to apologize for what he had to show me next. He slid a single notarized sheet across the desk. I looked down, expecting another bank transfer, but this was different. Julian hadn't just stolen the liquid assets, he had taken a high-interest private loan using the Oaks, my ancestral home, the place Catherine and I had tended for 40 years as undisclosed collateral. I felt my stomach drop as I saw the signature on the mortgage for my own home, Catherine Thorne. It was dated weeks after she had been buried in the family plot. The glass elevator ascended the side of the skyscraper like a bubble in a pressurized pipe, carrying me toward a dinner party hosted by a thief who shared my DNA. I watched the Charleston skyline drop away, the historic steeples and cobblestones, replaced by the cold steel geometry of the New South. My stomach was a knot of lead, weighted by the notarized sheet Robert had slid across his desk only hours ago. The forged signature of my dead wife was a ghost that followed me into this rising cage. When the doors hissed open, I was greeted not by a home, but by an exhibition of stolen wealth. I pulled my modest sedan into the sweeping circular driveway of Julian's downtown penthouse building, passing the silent, sleek silhouette of his new Tesla Model S Plaid. Every silent mile of that car had been paid for by the trust Julian systematically dismantled, while I was in the depths of mourning for Catherine. Nice car, Julian, I muttered to myself, the words tasting like copper. It is amazing what one can afford these days when conscience is factored out of the budget. I took a breath, forcing the air deep into my lungs, commanding my hands to stop their microscopic trembling. I needed to act the part of the fool. Julian Thorne, my 44-year-old son, stood in the doorway of his penthouse, his charcoal Italian suit and practiced smile masking the financial rot beneath his feet. He reached out his hand, clasping my shoulder with a firmness that felt more like a test of structural integrity than an embrace. "Dad, you look a bit tired," he said, his voice smooth as polished marble. "Is the house getting to be too much for you?" "It is just the stairs, Julian," I replied, letting my voice waver just enough to satisfy his expectations. "My knees aren't what they used to be." I stepped past him into a palace of glass and Carrara marble. Bianca Thorne, Julian's 41-year-old wife and a high-end event planner, greeted me with a brief, cool embrace that felt more like a social obligation than a family welcome. The air was heavy with the scent of expensive lilies, a cloying sweet aroma that smelled like a funeral to me. My eyes drifted to the large abstract painting dominating the far wall, a chaos of blue and gold. Julian had claimed to have discovered it at a small gallery in Chelsea, but I recognized the texture. It was listed in our estate documents as an investment asset that was supposedly lost in the market downturn last spring. Luxury is a loud mask for a quiet conscience. I cataloged the excess with the cold precision of an auditor. The floor-to-ceiling glass walls, the clinical touch of the counters, the blinding reflection of the setting sun. Bianca led us toward the dining area, her movements fluid and rehearsed. As she reached for a heavy crystal wine glass to serve the vintage red, I caught the sharp glint of a new diamond bracelet on her wrist. The stones were bespoke, catching the light, in a way that felt like a needle to the eye. That is a beautiful piece, Bianca. I noted, my tone carefully neutral. A gift. She smiled, a flash of white teeth that didn't reach her eyes. Julian surprised me with it, she said, her voice tinkling like the ice in a shaker. He said we had a particularly good quarter. I took a sip of the wine. It tasted like copper and old lies. Julian began to boast about his latest venture, the Pelican Bay Marina project, his hands gesturing grandly as he spoke of slips and revenue streams. He was a performer basking in the light of his own perceived brilliance, entirely unaware that the man across the table was no longer his audience, but his judge. Bianca adjusted her bracelet, the diamonds clinking against the crystal with a sound like a countdown. It was a celebration, she added, her eyes darting briefly to Julian, for Julian finally securing the long-term stability of the family home. The word home felt like a profanation. She knew, perhaps not the details of the ink on the page, but she knew the foundation was built on a grave. Julian leaned in, his eyes bright with a predatory concern that made my skin crawl. "Dad," he whispered, leaning across the marble, "have you thought more about what we discussed about the oaks?" Julian's concern was a sharp instrument, a silver-plated knife he kept pressing against the softest parts of my life, while I pretended not to feel the edge. He guided me toward the dining table with a hand heavy on my shoulder, his grip possessing the subtle oppressive weight of a warden escorting a prisoner. The dining room was a theater of excess, dominated by the rich, savory smell of expensive dry-aged steak that made my stomach turn. I took my seat, the Carrara marble tabletop feeling like a slab of ice beneath my forearms. Julian didn't wait for the wine to be poured before he returned to the attack, his voice dropping into that rehearsed tone of filial piety. "The marina is going to redefine luxury on the East Coast, Dad," he said, leaning in until I could see the predatory spark in his pupils. "We just need to stay aggressive. The Oaks is a beautiful memory, but it's a drain on your resources. I've already had a preliminary appraiser take a look at the grounds just to get a sense of the value for the estate planning." "It sounds marvelous, Julian," I replied, forcing a fragile smile to my lips. "Your mother always said you had a grand vision." Internally, I was cataloging the frantic speed of his movements. A preliminary appraiser. He was moving much faster than the documents at Robert's office had suggested. He wasn't just planning a theft. He was preparing for a liquidation. I watched him boast about his Hilton Head project, calling it the Thorne family's next crown jewel, while I nodded like a man whose mind was as brittle as old parchment. Have you ever looked into the eyes of someone you raised and seen only the calculation of your own worth in their pupils? It is a unique kind of soul sickness, a realization that the person you gave life to is now simply waiting for yours to become an asset. The dinner felt like an eternity of suppressed rage. Julian and Bianca spoke in circles about market trends and social standings, their words drifting over me like smoke. By the time the meal ended, my jaw ached from the effort of maintaining my submissive mask. Julian walked me to the elevator, his hand returning to my shoulder as the mechanical hum of the elevator cables vibrated through the floor. "Just send the forms to my email." "Dad," he said as the door slid open, "I'll take care of the heavy lifting so you can focus on your hobbies." "You're a good son, Julian," I replied, stepping into the glass car. "I don't know what I'd do without you." The elevator dinged. The mask stayed on until the doors fully closed. As the car descended, I leaned my head against the cool glass and let the persona of the weary father shatter. The descent was rapid, a mirror of my own dive into the dark reality of my family's collapse. I drove away from the gilded heights of the penthouse, my modest sedan feeling like a life raft in a rising tide of filth. I didn't head for the Oaks. Instead, I navigated the quiet, humid streets toward a nondescript office building where the lights still burned on the third floor. Robert Martinez was waiting for me in what he called the war room, but the real shock was the woman sitting beside him. Nicolette Veda, a 29-year-old specialist in cyber forensics, with a no-nonsense undercut and eyes like a hawk, began unpacking her encrypted drive as if she were preparing for a digital siege. "Mr. Thorne Roberts says you want to see the ghost in the machine," she said, her voice clinical and devoid of the false warmth I'd endured all evening. "I want to see exactly how my son used my grief as a currency," I told her, sinking into a cold leather chair that felt more honest than Julian's silk upholstery. The room was dark lit, only by the sterile blue light of computer monitors. Nicolette's fingers flew across the keys, and my own social security number appeared on the screen, linked to a secondary line of credit I had never authorized. She explained it was for a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands. My blood ran colder than a Charleston winter. Nicolette tapped a key and a flowchart appeared that made the room spin. Julian wasn't just stealing to save his business. He was laundering money for people who didn't take kindly to failure. Nicolette didn't just show me numbers. She peeled back the skin of my son's business until the muscle and bone of his greed lay exposed on the monitor. The darkened war room was silent except for the static hum of the server tower and the rhythmic clicking of Nicolette's mouse. Blue light reflected off my glasses, casting a ghostly glow over the bank statements that detailed the systematic dismantling of my life. She focused the display on a specific transaction that had occurred on the day of Catherine's funeral, a wire transfer of $300,000 to an account I didn't recognize. My son hadn't just used the trust money, Nicolette explained, her voice steady and clinical. He used your identity to co-sign a $2 million construction bond for the marina project. That bond is currently in default, Mr. Thorne. If the creditors come knocking, they aren't going to Julian's penthouse. They're coming to your front door. The air-conditioned chill of the secure room seemed to seep into my bones, a cold that no wool sweater could ever ward off. Nicolette broke down the architecture of Coastal Capital Holdings LLC, revealing it as a classic shell game designed to move large sums of money without alerting federal regulators. She showed me how the $5.7 million stolen from the Thorne Trust didn't stay in Julian's pocket, but was immediately wired to a dizzying array of vendors and high interest. Creditors. He's not building an empire, Mr. Thorne, she said, looking me in the eye. He's trying to plug a sinking dam with your retirement. Every dollar he took was a minute of Catherine's life he sold for a lie. Click. Another million gone. Click. Another lie. Confirmed. The smell of stale coffee and printer toner hung heavy in the air as the investigation shifted to the Pelican Bay Marina project in Hilton Head. Nicolette presented public records that made my heart hammer against my ribs. The project had been under a stop work order for 6 months due to severe environmental violations and a mountain of unpaid contractors. Julian had been using the shell company to pay hush money to early investors desperate to prevent a full-scale fraud investigation from reaching the authorities. The marina is a ghost town. Elias Robert Martinez added his hand, resting on the back of my chair. Just rusted rebar, empty slips, and a few foundations sinking into the salt marsh. He told me at dinner it was booming. I whispered the betrayal, tasting like ash in my mouth. He looked me in the eye and lied about the very thing he was killing me for. The satellite image was a portrait of a crime, a canvas of gray concrete and brown mud painted with my blood. Nicolette zoomed in until I could see the rusted rebar protruding from the earth like the ribs of a starved animal. That marshland is where your wife's legacy went to die, Robert said, his voice dropping an octave. The balloon payment for the land is due in 30 days, Elias. If he doesn't produce the capital, he faces criminal litigation from the primary landowners. The balloon payment is the catalyst. That's why he needs the Oaks now. He doesn't just want a sale. He needs a sacrifice. I leaned closer to the screen, my heart hammering, as Nicolette opened a hidden email thread. She had bypassed a layer of encryption that Julian clearly thought was impenetrable. The messages weren't to business partners or architects. Julian was reporting to an offshore manager who, according to Nicolette's database, was a notorious predatory lender based in the Caymans. My son wasn't just a thief. He was a subordinate being coerced from above by people who viewed the Thorne estate as a line item on a ledger. Robert put his hand on my shoulder as a new name popped up in the email. Header's a name that shouldn't have been there, a name that belonged to one of my closest friends. I stared at the screen, my vision blurring, as I recognized the personal email address of Gregory Matthews, the man who had delivered the eulogy at Catherine's funeral. The betrayal of a son is a wound that bleeds, but the betrayal of a lifelong friend is a poison that seeps into every memory you once held dear. I leaned closer to the monitor in Robert's darkened war room, my heart hammering against my ribs as I recognized the personal email address of Gregory Matthews. Gregory, the man who had stood by me when we lowered Catherine into the earth. Gregory, who had handled our family real estate for 3 decades. I stared at the name until the letters blurred into a gray smear. Not Gregory, I whispered, my voice sounding like dry leaves skittering across pavement. Anyone but Gregory. Robert Martinez placed a heavy hand on my shoulder, his expression a mixture of pity and professional hardness. He is not your friend anymore. Ilias Robert said, his silver-rimmed glasses catching the blue light of the screen. He is a commission-hungry wolf in a navy blazer. Robert's investigation had unmasked the true rot. Gregory didn't just have a professional interest in liquidating the Oaks. He had a secret investment stake in Julian's failing marina project. He wasn't just Julian's scout. He was a co-conspirator, a man trying to claw back his own losses by helping my son carve the meat from my bones. I realized then that I couldn't confront him. I had to use him. If they wanted a victim, I would give them a sacrificial lamb, so convincing they wouldn't notice the knife I was sharpening in the dark. Have you ever practiced sounding like a broken version of yourself just to see who would try to pick up the pieces and steal them? It is a surreal exercise, a form of self-inflicted psychological surgery. On Thursday morning, I sat in my study at the Oaks, surrounded by the rhythmic mocking tick of a dozen clocks. I picked up my smartphone, the screen slick and cold against my palm, and dialed Julian. When he picked up, I let my voice waver, thinning out the usual gravely resonance of my speech. Julian, I can't find the blue folder, I said, allowing a tremor of distress to creep into my tone. Your mother always put the tax receipts on the left. You know how she was about the left side of the desk. There was a pause on the other end, the kind of silence that feels like a predator scenting the air. Take a breath, Dad, Julian replied, his voice adopting a sugary, patronizing warmth that made my skin crawl. You're just getting a bit muddled. It happens. Don't worry. I already took that mail to my office to handle the taxes for you. Remember, I pretended to struggle with the memory, repeating the question about the folder twice more until he chuckled a soft, shark-like sound. I ended the call and sat in the silence of the study, the smell of old dust on the tax ledgers suddenly overwhelming. An hour later, I called him again. I asked the exact same question about the blue folder using the same words, the same confused cadence. Oh dear. Did I already call? I asked, my voice small. My head is like a clock with a loose mainspring today, Julian. I'm so sorry. Click. The predator had heard the limping gait of his prey. Now the hunt was truly on. I could practically hear the gears turning in my son's head, the calculations of a man who realized his father might finally be incompetent enough to be legally sidelined. Don't you worry about a thing, Dad, Julian said, and I could hear the triumph vibrating in his throat. I'm going to take all that weight off your shoulders very soon. In fact, I've already spoken to a specialist who helps families transition their elderly parents to safer, more manageable living environments. I'll come by to discuss it. You just need to rest. As the line went dead, the silence of the study felt heavier than before. The bitter, dry feeling in my throat made it hard to swallow. Julian wasn't just planning to steal my money anymore. He was already shopping for the cage he intended to put me in. He was looking for a way to turn the house I loved into a cell, all while wearing the smile of a devoted son. I didn't wait for the ink to dry on my performance before returning to the blue-lit sanctuary of Nicolette's monitors, where the truth was far less forgiving than my son's voice. After hanging up that second call to Julian, the tremors in my hands were no longer feigned. The realization that he was already speaking to specialists about my transition to a safer environment felt like the first cold shovel of dirt hitting a casket. I navigated the familiar humid streets of Charleston toward the Martinez Law Office, my mind a whirl of gears and springs. Inside the secure war room, the sterile recycling smell of the office air conditioning greeted me, a sharp contrast to the stagnant grief of the Oaks. Nicolette Veda sat perched before her array of screens, her eyes reflecting the jagged red lines of an offshore wire transfer flowchart that looked like a cancerous growth. Mr. Thorne, we found the heart of the leak, she said, her voice clinical and devoid of sentiment. The $5.7 million stolen from the trust wasn't entirely swallowed by the Hilton Head Marina or the Italian suits. She tapped a key highlighting a massive $4 million discrepancy funneled through the Caymans. I leaned in, the numbing sensation in my fingertips spreading up my arms. Reserved for what I asked, my voice a hollow rasp. He's already gutted the trust. I assumed it was for the developers. Nicolette shook her head, the blue flickering light of the monitors reflecting in Robert Martinez's glasses as he leaned over her shoulder. It wasn't lost in the project, Elias Robert said, and I didn't like the gravity in his tone. It was intentionally siphoned into a discretionary fund to pay for your own illegal detention abroad. Data is like water. It finds the cracks in even the most polished lies. Nicolette bypassed a secondary firewall, her fingers dancing across the keys. with a speed that mirrored the racing of my heart. She pulled up a wire transfer of $120,000 to a facility called Sonnenhof Residence in Lichern, Switzerland. Robert explained that this wasn't a nursing home. It was a high-security private internment center for the wealthy. It specializes in memory care where residents are legally sequestered from their home country's jurisdictions. He's not just stealing your money, Elias Robert whispered. He's buying you a one-way ticket to a gilded cage. He wants me thousands of miles away. I realized the horror finally crystallizing into a cold, hard focus. A place where I can't speak, I can't sue, and I certainly can't tell anyone about the marina or the trust. A printer whirred to life in the corner, spitting out a document that felt like a death warrant. It was a forged medical report from a Swiss neurologist declaring me as having Stage 3 Alzheimer's, citing erratic behavior and cognitive failure as the primary reason for immediate, permanent admission. The premeditation was staggering. Julian wasn't just reacting to a failing project, he was engineering my social death with the same precision I once used to build a tourbillon, a one-way ticket. That was the value of my life to my only son. Look at the flight reservation, Mr. Thorne Nicolette said, pointing to a confirmation code. It was booked for next March. March. He was going to give me one last Christmas at the Oaks before making me disappear into the Swiss mountains. I stared at a recovered email thread, the words blurring, until I noticed the alias Julian was using to communicate with the facility Miller. It was Catherine's maiden name. He was turning his dead mother's identity into a tool for my exile, a final insult that burned through the last of my paternal hesitation. He had already paid the first security deposit to ensure I would never leave Switzerland alive. My heart felt like a mainspring wound, too tight, humming with a frequency that demanded release. I looked at Robert, the clarity returning to my eyes with a sharpness that made him blink. If Julian wants to move me into a cage, I told him, then I suppose I had better give him a reason to rush his plans. I'm going to start the rumor about selling the house in Arizona. We need to force his hand before March arrives. I carried the news of my own eviction in my pocket, a scripted lie designed to set my son's world on fire before he could ship me off to a Swiss grave. The air near the Charleston harbor was thick with salt, and the low, heavy scent of marsh mud as I walked toward the harbor diner. It was a place of routine and comfort for the retired men of this city, but today the bell above the door chimed like a warning bell on a ship navigating a fog bank. Inside the atmosphere was a cloying mixture of burnt coffee and maple syrup. I spotted him in our usual corner booth, his manicured nails tapping a restless rhythm against his leather briefcase. Gregory Matthews, a 68-year-old real estate agent with a permanent tan and a blazer that smelled of expensive cologne and cheap desperation, stood to greet me. Elias, you look like you have had a rough few nights, he said, his voice carrying a warmth I now recognized as purely transactional. I slid onto the sticky vinyl of the booth, feeling the weight of the digital evidence Nicolette had uncovered. Every smile he gave me was a tooth in a trap. It is the house, Greg, I said, allowing my voice to thin out to sound fragile and exhausted. Every corner of the Oaks is just a ghost of Catherine now. I cannot live with the silence anymore. Gregory leaned in his expression, shifting into a mask of deep, practiced sympathy. I noticed he didn't wait long before mentioning that he had already seen some interest in properties like the Oaks from a mystery buyer in the city. He was shopping my home behind my back for weeks, likely under Julian's quiet direction, preparing for the moment I was legally erased. I stared at his hands and thought of the eulogy he had given for my wife. Gregory smiled. It was the smile of a man checking the weight of a gold coin with his teeth. I decided it was time to let the bait hit the water. I've made a decision, Greg. I'm going to sell the Oaks and everything in it. I'm moving to a luxury retirement community in Scottsdale, Arizona. I need the dry air, the sun. I need to be somewhere where the shadows don't look like her. Gregory's eyes widened, the pupils dilating with a mix of professional greed and calculated panic. Arizona. That is a big move, Elias. A massive move. Have you talked to Julian about this? I shook my head, feigning a weary, confidential tone. No, I want to surprise him. I just need a fresh start, Greg. I want to be gone by the end of the month. Can you help me move it quietly? I watched the gears turn behind his tanned forehead. He was likely calculating Julian's reaction and the threat this sudden move posed to the Swiss internment plan. How many years of friendship are required to justify a 3% commission on a dead woman's dream? For Gregory, the answer was clearly 0. He attempted to counsel me against a quick sale, suggesting the market was low and that I should wait, but I leaned across the table, making my eyes wide and slightly frantic. I want an appraiser walkthrough by Friday, Greg. I've already looked at the floor plans for Scottsdale. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small folded piece of paper. It was a printed map of a luxury facility in Arizona I'd researched with Nicolette, with a handwritten address in Scottsdale scrawled in a shaky, desperate hand. I made sure he saw it before I intentionally left it on the table tucked under my saucer. I've made up my mind, Greg. Time is a luxury I don't have anymore. He promised to keep it quiet while his hand drifted toward his phone on the table. I stood up, feeling a cold, hollow triumph. As I pushed through the diner's glass door, I glanced back through the grease-smeared window. Gregory's phone was already pressed to his ear, and he was hunched over the table, likely photographing the Scottsdale note to send to Julian as proof of my mental collapse. The fuse was lit, and the flame was traveling fast toward the center of my son's house of cards. My phone didn't just ring, it screamed with the frantic vibrations of a man watching his escape route crumble in real time. I hadn't even reached for the ignition when the plastic console began to rattle under the assault. Julian's name flashed in an aggressive, pulsating red on the screen. I watched the phone dance for a few seconds, taking a steadying breath of the salt-tinged Charleston air before sliding the thumb across the glass. I let my voice drop into that thin, hesitant register I had practiced. Hello, Julian. Dad Gregory says you were selling the Oaks. Tell me he is joking, my son demanded, his voice breathless and sharp. He sounded like a man who had just seen a ghost, or perhaps something more frightening to him, a lost commission. I paused, letting the silence stretch just long enough to mimic a failing memory. Oh, Gregory. Yes, we had a nice chat. I just need some sun, Julian. The shadows here in this house, they're getting too long. They are suffocating me. Julian let out a sound that was half laugh, half growl. You can't just sell the family legacy because you're feeling sentimental, Dad. Besides, I already called that realtor you were planning to see and canceled the appointment. You aren't in the right headspace for these kinds of decisions. He was already exercising unauthorized control over my life, reaching into my schedule with the cold hands of a warden. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white, but kept my response tremulous. You canceled it. But I thought, well, maybe you're right. Everything is so muddled lately. Julian's tone shifted instantly to a patronizing, oily calm. Exactly. Look, Bianca and I are coming over Friday at 7. We need to have a serious discussion about the estate's future. Don't do anything else until then. Is it still called a home if the person who shares your name is already treating it like an estate sale? I sat in the stillness of the parking lot, long after he hung up, the weight of the betrayal, feeling like a physical pressure behind my eyes. I reached out to Nicolette. Her voice was a clinical contrast to Julian's panic. The equipment is ready, Mr. Thorne. It is inside the mainspring housing of the carriage clock. It is virtually invisible to the naked eye. I drove back to the Oaks with a calculating focus that would have terrified my son if he could see past my weary mask. The house was a tomb of silence as I entered, but the study offered its familiar quiet sanctuary. I locked the heavy oak door, the creak of the hinges sounding like a final warning. I picked up Catherine's 40th anniversary brass carriage clock, the cold, smooth weight of it a grounding force in my hands. With the precision of a trained analyst, I began to disassemble the base. The faint scent of brass and old paper filled the air, a familiar comfort of order and truth. I fitted the sugar cube-sized recorder into the void near the housing. The screwdriver slipped once, leaving a tiny scratch on the brass. A tiny scratch on the brass. A permanent scar for a permanent betrayal. I felt a profound, chilling irony as I worked. The very gift that celebrated 4 decades of trust was now the weapon I would use to expose the fruit of that trust's corruption. You always said time reveals all things, Catherine, I whispered to the empty room. Let us see what our son says when he thinks no one is listening. As I tested the connection to the remote receiver, the speaker hissed to life with a lingering audio fragment from Julian's previous visit. My heart stopped. It was the sound of drawers opening, the frantic rustle of paper, and Julian's muffled cursing. He had already been searching my workshop for the trust documents while I was in the kitchen fixing him tea. He wasn't even waiting for me to be gone. He was already looting the room while I breathed the same air. I set the clock back on the mantel in the study, its rhythmic ticking sounding less like a heartbeat and more like a countdown to a funeral Julian didn't know was his own. The front door didn't just open, it served as the velvet curtain, rising on the most dangerous performance of my 71 years. The sound of the heavy brass knocker echoed in the empty hall, a rhythmic, authoritative demand for entry that made my chest tighten. I took a final steadying breath, pressing my palms against the cool wood of the wainscoting before I pulled the handle. Julian and Bianca stood there silhouetted against the fading South Carolina dusk. They were polished, gleaming, and utterly lethal. Julian stepped forward, gripping my shoulder with a strength that felt more like a tactical arrest than an expression of affection. "Dad, you look frail," he said, his voice dropping into a register of practiced concern. Gregory's news really worried us. Bianca followed him in the smell of expensive wood-fired Cabernet, preceding her like a scout. She handed me the bottle, her smile tight. I knew without looking that it had been bought with my own stolen dividends. As I led them into the living room, I feigned a slight tremor in my hands, allowing my steps to be just a little too short, my gaze just a little too wandering. I made sure we passed the mantel where Catherine's brass carriage clock sat in silent, bugged vigil. My eyes caught a glint on Bianca's blouse. She was wearing a pearl and sapphire brooch that had belonged to Catherine, one that had been listed as lost during the estate inventory 6 months ago. The sight of it felt like a physical blow to my solar plexus, but I merely blinked, playing the part of the man who couldn't remember his own jewelry box. "It's just the damp, Julian," I murmured, easing myself into my armchair with a grunt of feigned effort. "It gets into the bones and the memory alike." Julian wasted no time. He opened a leather-bound folder on the coffee table, the blue light from his tablet flickering against the antique wallpaper. He began to spread out charts and projections, his finger tracing lines of growth and stability that I knew were fabrications. He spoke to me as if I were a child, explaining that the move to Arizona was too fast and too confusing for someone of my standing. His voice was like warm honey poured over a bed of rusted nails. "We just want you safe, Dad," he urged, leaning in. "The Oaks is your anchor. You don't want to cast yourself adrift at this stage. An anchor can be a heavy thing to drag when you're tired, Julian," I replied, staring blankly at a bar graph that supposedly proved my financial ruin if I sold the house. I watched Bianca out of the corner of my eye. She remained silent, but her eyes were restless, darting nervously toward the workshop door as if expecting the house itself to testify against them. I felt a surge of cold observation, a clarity that allowed me to see the sweat on Julian's upper lip despite the air conditioning. He was desperate. I waited for the right moment, then pressed my fingers to my temples, letting out a sharp, shallow hiss of breath. My head. "I'm sorry, Julian. These numbers, they're spinning. I think I need a moment. I should put the kettle on for some tea." Julian's expression flickered with a flash of arrogant triumph. He thought he had overwhelmed me. "Take your time, Dad," he said, leaning back with a smug set to his jaw. "We're not going anywhere." I stood up shakily, waving off Bianca's half-hearted attempt to help. "No, no. I know where the tea is kept." I walked toward the kitchen, the high-pitched, lonely whistle of the tea kettle already beginning to sound in the distance. As the swinging door closed behind me, I heard the subtle shift in the room's atmosphere. Julian signaled to Bianca, and even through the wood, I could sense them beginning a sweep of the room, checking for anything out of place. The kettle whistled, a scream for the truth in a house of whispers. I leaned my back against the cold, damp kitchen counter, my heart thundering against my ribs until it was the only thing I could hear. With trembling fingers that were no longer acting, I pulled my phone from my pocket and tapped the app. The speaker hummed to life, and I heard my son's voice drop into a cold, lethal rasp. I stood among the porcelain cups and the cloying scent of Earl Grey, listening to my only son calculate the cost of my legal execution. The kitchen was a sanctuary of domestic normalcy. The refrigerator hummed. The linoleum was cool beneath my slippers, but the distorted sound of Julian's voice bleeding through the phone's speaker turned the room into a crime scene. His artificial warmth had evaporated the moment the kitchen door swung shut. "The Arizona plan is a disaster, Bianca," he hissed the static-filled rasp of the phone speaker, stripping away the last of my illusions. "If he calls a realtor, Gregory can't bury the discrepancies anymore. We're exposed. If the house is sold, the creditors for the marina will find the missing millions, and I'll be facing federal charges before the year's out." Julian admitted he had already drafted conservatorship paperwork and intended to trick me into signing a medical consent form tonight. That was actually a voluntary waiver of my autonomy. He needed the oaks as collateral for his failing project, and he needed me silent. How does a man listen to his own child describe him as an expendable asset and not let the porcelain in his hands shatter? I gripped the edge of the counter, my cold, damp sweat making the stone slippery. I heard the rustle of papers in the living room as Julian outlined his plan for a permanent conservatorship. He mentioned he had already paid a psychiatrist to sign a preliminary assessment and had witnesses lined up to testify to my recent erratic behavior. He described me as a resource that needed to be locked down before it could be spent, his voice devoid of a single shred of empathy. It's the only way, he said, his tone as clinical as a surgeon's. Once the court grants me control, I'll ship him to that facility in Switzerland. He's confused. He's mourning. It's for his own protection. That's the story we stick to. The bone china on the silver tray rattled as my hands shook with a primal bone-deep fury. He wasn't just my son. He was the architect of my erasure. I heard Bianca offer a brief, weak protest about the ethics of a total lockdown, but Julian silenced her with a sharp reminder of their own mounting debt. You want to keep the penthouse. You want to stay out of a cell. Then we do this, Julian snapped. Bianca's voice shifted then, gaining a terrifying edge of practicality, as she suggested the specific internment facility in Lucerne, because she had a cousin on the board who could ensure no prying eyes ever gained access. I realized she wasn't just a passenger in his greed, she was the navigator. I carefully shut off the app, the silence of the kitchen feeling like a physical weight. I arranged the cookies, the artificial lemon scent mixing with the steam of the tea, and took a long, steadying breath. I walked back into the living room, the tray heavy in my hands. Julian immediately adjusted his posture, leaning back with a supportive golden boy smile that made my skin crawl. Sorry for the wait, kids, I said, my voice thin and apologetic as I set the tray down with a purposeful clatter. These old fingers don't move like they used to. My head is still a bit fuzzy from all those numbers you were showing me. Julian reached out and patted my hand, his touch oily and false. Don't worry, Dad. We're here to take care of everything for you. We've got some simple forms for your healthcare just to make things easier. I caught my reflection in the silver teapot, a trembling ancient man on the surface. But underneath, I was an engineer who had just found the exact point where my son's structure would collapse. The recording was safe. The fuse was lit. All I had to do now was survive the night without letting them see the predator hiding behind my spectacles. The doorbell rang at exactly 8 a.m., but it wasn't the mailman. It was a man in a cheap suit handing me a folder that officially stripped me of my sanity. I stood in the drafty entry hall of the Oaks, the heavy oak door still vibrating from the knock. The process server didn't offer a greeting, only a clinical nod and a dry rasping sound as the legal paper was thrust into my hand. I looked down at the bold, cold font of the summons, my vision swimming for a moment before the rage anchored me. It was a petition for emergency temporary conservatorship, a document that transformed my lifelong sanctuary into a courtroom exhibit. I retreated to my study, the silence of the house broken only by the distant morning sound of a foghorn from the Charleston harbor. Julian's accusations were laid out in a list of precise surgical lies, erratic financial decisions, unexplained paranoia regarding family assets, and documented memory lapses. The coward had even included a forged statement from Dr. Aris, a neurologist I hadn't seen in over 5 years, claiming a history of progressive cognitive decline. Before I could even finish the first page, my phone buzzed. It was Robert Martinez. He did it, Robert, I said, my voice gravelly with a suppressed fury. He's filed the papers. Robert's sigh was heavy through the speaker. It's a scorched earth policy, Elias. He's using the Arizona house sale rumor you planted as his primary evidence of your incompetence. He's trying to freeze your life before the sun even comes up. I sat at my mahogany desk, spreading the character assassination across the surface. I wasn't a father anymore. I was a respondent in a case file. Julian had been busy. He'd gathered witness statements from neighbors and even a detailed affidavit from Gregory Matthews. My oldest friend had officially sold our 40 years of shared history for a court-ordered commission claiming I appeared disoriented and spoke nonsense about fleeing to the desert. They were turning my grief into a clinical diagnosis, ignoring the sharp engineering mind that had kept this estate running, long before Julian learned to balance a checkbook. I felt a cold sense of isolation settle into my bones, a realization that the walls I had built to protect my family were now being used to cage me. The legal document painted me as a flickering candle in a dark room, a man who could no longer be trusted with his own keys. When did the boy I taught to ride a bike become the man designing my cage? I found myself staring at the dust motes dancing in the light, wondering if anyone else in this city still saw the man I actually was. A faint scratching at the back garden gate pulled me from the dark spiral. I walked to the kitchen and saw Leo Thorne, my grandson, slipping through the door. He was pale, his eyes rimmed with red, and he clutched his phone as if it were a weapon. He smelled of damp earth and adrenaline. "Grandpa!" I found his laptop open. Leo whispered, his voice cracking. He deleted his search history, but I recovered the cache. "He's not trying to help you. He's been researching involuntary commitment procedures in South Carolina. He has a list of memory care facilities that look more like high-security prisons." I looked at the boy, seeing the thorn integrity Julian had somehow failed to extinguish. Leo's hand was trembling as he pulled up a file on his phone screen, the piercing blue light illuminating the kitchen shadow. "He's already contacted a locksmith," Leo said, handing me a printed screenshot. "He's changing the house codes at the Oaks the second the emergency order is signed tomorrow. He wants to lock you out of your own life." I took the paper, my fingers brushing Leo's cold skin. The subject line of the email from Julian to the locksmith read, "Access termination, November 6th. The architecture of my erasure was nearly complete, but Julian had forgotten one thing. An engineer knows that the more complex the trap, the more points there are for it to fail. I looked at the screenshot, then at my grandson, and felt the last of my hesitation vanish. I didn't open the door for Dr. Rodriguez as a victim. I opened it as a man who had spent 40 years ensuring portfolios didn't collapse under pressure. The screenshot Leo had shown me of Julian's email to the locksmith was still burned into my mind, a digital countdown to my own eviction. When the doorbell chimed, I smoothed my collar and stepped out of the shadows of the study. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a court-appointed psychiatrist with a gaze like a laser and a notebook that held the power to end my legal life, stepped into the study. She carried a scent of expensive clinical perfume that felt entirely out of place among the scent of old leather and aged paper. I watched her eyes immediately scan the room, looking for signs of the erratic hoarder Julian had described in his petition. Before she could even click her ballpoint pen against her clipboard, she offered a curious admission. "Mr. Thorne, your son was quite insistent on briefing me privately before I arrived," she said, her voice neutral but her eyes watchful. "He wanted to provide context for your recent behaviors." I offered her a thin, dry smile. "I imagine he did. My son thinks the numbers are slipping, Doctor. Let me show you how they actually work." I led her to the desk where decades of portfolio analysis lay in meticulous order. I began to explain the mathematical precision required for risk-adjusted returns, detailing the compound interest calculations and diversification models I had built over 40 years. The rhythmic, comforting tap of my pen against the ledger provided a steady backbeat to my lecture. I didn't stumble over a single technical term. "Mr. Thorne, your recall of financial theory is unexpected for someone in your alleged condition." She noted the constant clicking of her pen, finally falling silent. "How do you prove you're sane to a world that has already decided you're a burden?" The question hung in the air, unasked but heavy. I showed her my daily journals and investment logs arranged with obsessive order. I pulled the log for the last 3 years, showing her the entry for every morning, every portfolio review, and every financial transaction. I addressed the Arizona rumor, directly showing her the spreadsheets I'd built to compare property taxes and maintenance costs. Arizona isn't a fantasy, Doctor. It's an exit strategy for a house that has grown too large for its memories. It is a rational decision to preserve capital. She flipped through the pages, her clinical detachment beginning to melt into a genuine professional respect. "I'm looking for a man who forgot his own birthday, Mr. Thorne," she said, closing her notebook with a sharp snap. "I haven't found him yet." After she left, the metallic sour taste of adrenaline lingered in my mouth. I had won the battle, but the war was still escalating. My phone pinged with an encrypted alert from Nicolette Veda. I opened the file, the blue, cold light of the screen illuminating the deepening shadows of the study. Silence is the investor's greatest tool. And right now, the silence was deafening as I read what Nicolette had finally unmasked. She had cracked the encryption on Julian's offshore transactions to the Sonnenhof residence in Switzerland. It wasn't just a care plan. Julian had paid a $120,000 consultation fee directly to the director of the facility. It's not memory care. Elias Nicolette's voice came through the encrypted line, sounding small and horrified. It's a paid kidnapping. The bribe included a clause for permanent residency, ensuring I would be admitted without an independent medical review, and that no family contact was authorized. $120,000 was the price Julian put on my disappearance. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. He never intended for me to have a return flight. He was paying for a gilded cage where the door only opened inward. Nicolette's voice turned into a whisper as she read the final note on the Swiss wire transfer. Patient arrival confirmed for November 15th. No family contact authorized. I spent 40 years learning to read a balance sheet by its patterns, but it took only 40 seconds to realize my son had forged his mother's soul onto a piece of paper. The dawn light was a bruised purple filtering through the study windows. As I sat at my desk, the encrypted message from Nicolette still vibrating in my mind. $120,000 for a one-way ticket to Switzerland. No family contact authorized. The words were a cold current in my blood. I pulled Catherine's old journals, closed the leather worn and familiar, and placed the recent estate amendment alongside them. I lowered my reading glasses, the world narrowing to a focused view of the ink. Through the lens, the signature on the $2.1 million trust amendment was a battlefield. I compared it to her elegant, fluid handwriting from a decade ago. I saw the hesitation marks, the tiny, jagged tremors where the pen had stalled, and the unnatural pressure points that indicated a slow, deliberate tracing rather than the shaky hand of a dying woman. I searched further, my fingers trembling as I reached for one of her old ledgers stored in the back of the cabinet. There, tucked behind a loose binding, I found a hidden practice sheet. It was covered in dozens of attempts at her signature, some crude, some nearly perfect, all written in Julian's unmistakable, heavy-handed style. He was tracing your name, Catherine, while you were taking your last breaths in the room upstairs. The realization was a soul-crushing blow, a betrayal so absolute it felt like the mainspring of my life had finally snapped. How do you quantify the weight of a forgery when the ink is mixed with a mother's dying tears? I didn't have long to mourn the discovery. The sound of Robert Martinez's car tires on the gravel driveway announced the arrival of the final war council. Robert and Nicolette entered the study, their faces grim in the morning light. I showed them the practice sheet and the forensic discrepancies I had found under the loupe. Robert's eyes hardened, the reflective glass of his spectacles catching the study's light. "This isn't just a civil dispute anymore, Elias," he said, his voice dropping into a low, gravely register. "This elevates the case to a criminal felony. Forging a trust document of this magnitude carries a mandatory sentence. We don't just want the petition denied." "Robert," I replied, my voice finding an icy new resolve. "I want him in a cell. I want him to feel the walls closing in just as he planned for me." Nicolette checked her laptop, her fingers moving with a scratchy, rhythmic sound across the keyboard. "We're finalized for the dismantle strategy. We let him testify first. We let him commit himself to these lies under oath. The moment he confirms that signature is authentic on the stand, the trap doors open. We have the audio from the clock, the Swiss wire transfers, and now this." Robert leaned in, a final card to play. "I have secretly subpoenaed the director of the Sonnenhof facility to appear via video link. Julian won't be able to claim it was a misunderstanding once the man he bribed is staring at him from a monitor." The mainspring was tight. The gears were aligned. The strike was inevitable. I spent the rest of the day in a state of solemn readiness. I cleaned my finest charcoal suit, the cold, heavy weight of the wool jacket feeling like armor. I went through the house, winding every clock with the slow, deliberate turn of the key. The smell of beeswax and lemon polish on the mahogany was a comfort, a reminder of the order Catherine and I had maintained for 40 years. I looked at the brass carriage clock on the mantel one last time, ensuring the recording was secure. Tomorrow, the silence of the oaks would finally speak. "Time is up, Julian," I whispered to the empty study. "Help me stay steady, Catherine. Just one more day." As I blew out the candle in my study, the grandfather clock in the hall struck midnight, a deep, resonant toll that sounded like the first strike of a gavel. The blinding white light of the courthouse steps on Monday morning felt less like a new day and more like a spotlight on a stage I never asked to climb. I stood shielded from the glare by the massive limestone pillars of the Charleston County Courthouse. my hand gripping the handle of my briefcase until the leather groaned. The marble floors inside didn't just echo. They seemed to count down the seconds until my own son would tell the world I was no longer a man, but a vegetable. I took a steadying breath, the smell of floor wax and old paper drifting from the heavy bronze doors, and stepped into the air-conditioned chill of the lobby. Every footfall felt like a strike against my own legacy. I noticed a local reporter in the gallery who had been tipped off by Julian's team, and the realization hit me like a physical blow. Julian didn't just want control, he wanted a public record of my supposed insanity to ensure the Swiss facility wouldn't be questioned later. He was performing an autopsy on a living man. I entered the courtroom and felt the weight of a dozen gazes. Julian and Bianca were already seated at the petitioner's table. Julian looking remarkably stoic in a navy suit that projected nothing but somber responsibility. I took my seat next to Robert Martinez, keeping my spine straight and my expression as unyielding as the wooden bench beneath me. Eyes front, alias Robert, whispered, his voice a low anchor in the rising tide of my anxiety. Let them see the advisor, not the victim. I nodded once my gaze fixed on the empty bench, where Judge Patricia Caldwell would soon decide if I still owned my own life. Judge Patricia Caldwell, a woman with a face like etched granite, and eyes that had seen every flavor of family betrayal, sat behind the bench with an impassive stillness that made the room go silent. The rhythmic ticking of the wall clock behind her sounded like a heartbeat. Julian's lawyer, a man with a voice like polished mahogany, stood to begin his opening statement. He painted a tragic, sweeping picture of my decline, citing my sudden desire to sell the Oaks as the primary symptom of a failing mind. He wove a narrative where Julian was the hero, a devoted son stepping in to save his father from a slow mental bankruptcy. We are here to protect the legacy that Mr. Thorne is no longer capable of defending, he declared, his hand sweeping toward me as if I were a broken piece of furniture. The decision to liquidate the family estate is not a choice. It is a cry for help. I sat through the eulogy of a life I was still very much living, feeling a suppressed fury that threatened to crack my composure. If you're still here with me in this courtroom moment, leave a quick comment so I know you're still following the story. Just type "here" if you're still listening, or "listening" if you want to see how this trial unfolds. And before we continue, a quick note. The next part of the story contains some fictionalized elements added to strengthen the narrative and its message. If that's not your preference, this may be a good place to pause the video. The lawyer presented preliminary findings of my confusion, carefully omitting the fact that Julian had engineered every moment of my distress. My client takes no joy in this, Your Honor, he said, looking at the judge while Julian faked a look of profound sorrow. It is a burden of love. He then submitted a new piece of evidence, a video of me fumbling with my keys and looking lost in my own garden, a video Julian had secretly filmed from his car weeks ago, capturing a moment of simple fatigue and twisting it into a portrait of dementia. The statement peaked with the claim that I represented a danger to my own financial stability. Julian turned slightly and caught my eye, and for a split second the mask of the morning sun slipped, replaced by a cold, victorious smirk that said, I've already won. I didn't need to say a word. I simply sat back and watched as the first pillar of my son's house of lies was kicked out by a woman with a PhD and a memory like a steel trap. Robert Martinez rose to his feet with a deliberate, slow grace, adjusting his silver-rimmed glasses as he prepared to dismantle the performance we had just endured. Julian's smug expression, that cold smirk he had directed at me from across the aisle, didn't even have time to fade before Robert called our first witness to the stand. Doctor? Elena Rodriguez stepped forward, the rhythmic tapping of her heels on the marble floor, sounding like a metronome for the truth. Julian's lawyer immediately attempted to object, claiming her evaluation was redundant, but Judge Patricia Caldwell silenced him with a look so sharp it could have etched glass. Doctor. Rodriguez took her seat, her hand resting on the heavy polished Bible with a calm that signaled the end of my son's tactical advantage. She established her credentials with clinical efficiency, noting her 3-hour, in-person evaluation of my mental state, a stark contrast to the 20-minute phone call Julian's paid psychiatrist had used to diagnose me. Then came the moment that changed the temperature of the room. Doctor, Rodriguez revealed that Julian had attempted to offer her a significant donation to her research foundation if her evaluation went the right way. The scratchy sound of the court reporter's stenotype machine was the only noise in the sudden deafening silence. Doctor, in your professional opinion, does Elias Thorne suffer from any cognitive decline? Robert asked, his voice echoing in the stale, metallic air of the courtroom. On the contrary, she replied, looking Julian directly in the eye. Mr. Thorne's cognitive performance is in the 99th percentile for his age group. The truth isn't just a shield. It's a scalpel that cuts through the thickest layers of a silver-tongued lie. I watched Julian's knuckles turn white as he gripped the edge of his chair, the victorious glow on his face beginning to rot into a mottled, ghostly gray. Doctor? Rodriguez continued, detailing the complexity of the tests I had passed. She spoke of my ability to explain the three-dimensional physics of horology and the mathematical precision of my restoration logs. She testified that my interest in Arizona was a rational, strategic response to traumatic grief and financial pragmatism, not a symptom of dementia. In her clinical view, the petition was medically unfounded and highly suspicious. She was no longer just a doctor. She was a structural engineer of justice, identifying every crack Julian had tried to hide. Julian's lawyer attempted a desperate cross-examination, his voice rising in an effort to paint her as biased or easily manipulated by a lifelong performer. Are you suggesting my client's father is a better actor than he is an engineer? He demanded. Dr. Rodriguez didn't blink. She presented the biometric data she had recorded during our meeting. Heart rate and neurological responses that cannot be faked by a man in decline. I am stating that the data does not lie. Counselor, she said, perhaps you should look at your own sources. Silence. Absolute suffocating silence. You could hear the ink drying on the judge's pad as she leaned forward, her face like etched granite. Judge Caldwell asked the court reporter to read back the section regarding the bribery attempt, her eyes moving to Julian with a new lethal scrutiny. My son was no longer the petitioner. He was the primary suspect in a game he had lost the moment he underestimated me. I looked at Bianca, and for the first time, she didn't look at Julian for instructions. She looked at the exit, her hands visibly trembling as she realized the ship was taking on water. Doctor. Rodriguez stepped down, leaving a heavy silence in her wake, while Julian's legal team scrambled to whisper in a panic they could no longer hide. I watched the cursor blink on the courtroom's projector screen, a rhythmic pulse that signaled the death of my son's last possible defense. I sat with my hands folded my back, pressing against the cold oak of the chair, feeling a strange, hollow calmness. The previous hour had been a slow-motion car crash for Julian's legal team, but they were about to realize the impact hadn't even peaked. Robert Martinez gave a sharp nod to Nicolette Veda, who was perched over her laptop like an avenging angel of data. The hum of the courtroom projector fan filled the icy, stagnant air, and then the screen bloomed with a blue, flickering light. Nicolette displayed the wire transfer for $120,000, but it was the corresponding attachment that made the gallery fall into a stunned silence. It was an intake contract for the Sonnenhof residence in Switzerland. The document listed my name as the patient, and beneath a forged version of my own signature, Julian had checked a box labeled permanent involuntary internment. The contract explicitly stripped me of any right to communicate with outside legal counsel or my own family. Robert stepped into the well of the court, his voice echoing with a chilling horror. "This isn't a medical plan, Your Honor," he said, looking up at Judge Caldwell. "It's a bill of sale for a human being." The Oaks was listed in the fine print as the primary source for the facility's ongoing monthly maintenance fees. My son wasn't just exiling me. He was using my home as the currency for my own imprisonment. I noticed Julian's lawyer scratching his pen frantically across a legal pad, his face ashen. How do you breathe when you realize the person you love has been measuring you for a coffin made of Swiss banknotes? I looked at Julian, but he was staring straight ahead, his jaw locked in a desperate final defiance. He had scheduled me to be transported, not flown, but transported like cargo next Thursday. Robert didn't stop there. He presented a digital mapping of the medical reports Julian had submitted. He revealed that Dr. Heinrich Schmidt, the neurologist who had supposedly diagnosed my advanced dementia, didn't exist in any medical registry in the world. Nicolette had traced the IP address of the emails directly to Julian's private server in his downtown penthouse. The courtroom gasped as the depth of the fabrication was laid bare. Julian hadn't just played the son. He had played the doctor, the judge, and the jailer. "Is this true, Mr. Thorne?" Judge Caldwell asked, her voice like a cracking whip. Did you manufacture a medical professional to deceive this court? The mask didn't just crack, it disintegrated. Julian didn't answer, but beside him, Bianca Thorne began to tremble. Her sharp, stinging scent of expensive perfume seemed to sour as she stared at the screen. Her eyes were fixed on the transport date, the same date Julian had told her we were all going on a family holiday to the coast. The realization hit her with a physical force that made her gasp. Julian, you said we were taking him to the coast for a holiday, she whispered, her voice carrying through the silent room like a gunshot. Be quiet, Bianca, Julian hissed, but it was too late. Not now. Bianca let out a choked sob, her horror becoming the focal point of the entire courtroom. She leaned away from him as if he were made of plague. In a hushed, tearful outburst, she cried out that Julian had told her the $120,000 was a legal retainer to protect the family from my erratic behavior. He had lied to his accomplice, using her fear of bankruptcy to secure her silence while he planned a kidnapping. Bianca stood up her chair, screeching against the marble, and the look she gave Julian wasn't one of a wife to a husband. It was the look of a witness who had just seen a murder. I followed the sound of Bianca's heels clicking frantically against the marble, not out of pity, but because a crumbling alliance is the most effective way to finish a war. The judge had barely finished announcing the 10-minute recess before my daughter-in-law fled the room, her composure disintegrating with every step. I found her near the massive limestone pillars of the courthouse hallway, her body shaking with muffled, echoing sobs that bounced off the high ceiling. The smell of limestone and floor wax was sharp here, a clinical backdrop to the death of her marriage. She looked up at me, her face a mask of ruined mascara and genuine terror. He told me it was a retirement cruise, Elias, she choked out, clutching a handkerchief as if it were a life raft. He said you wanted to see the Alps, that you were tired of the humidity and the ghosts in this house. I didn't say a word. I simply pulled my phone from my pocket and showed her the digital vault Nicolette had cracked. I let her read the forged medical reports and the intake contract that stripped me of every human right. He didn't buy me a ticket to the Alps, Bianca. He bought me a cell with a view. He was willing to make you a widow in spirit just to keep his secrets. Bianca's eyes widened as she realized the depth of the deception. She revealed that Julian had already packed my bags and hidden them in a storage unit, intending to abduct me the moment a favorable ruling was signed. A marriage built on lies is a house built on sand. When the tide of truth comes in, the walls don't just crack, they vanish. Bianca reached into her designer bag and pulled out her own phone, her hands trembling so violently she almost dropped it. She showed me a series of frantic texts sent during the testimony, Julian's digital voice screaming in all caps to get out and destroy the tablet. Take it, she said, thrusting the device toward Robert Martinez, who had appeared quietly at my side. I won't go to prison for a man who would bury his own father alive. Robert took the phone with a grim nod of satisfaction. Robert, find Agent Mitchell, I said, my voice gravely articulate. The alliance just shattered. When the court reconvened, the atmosphere had shifted from tense to lethal. Robert called our next witness, Daniel Carson, a 60-year-old handwriting analyst, with the posture of a schoolmaster and a gaze that could dissect the history of a pen stroke. Carson adjusted his projector, the bright clinical light hitting the screen and washing out the faces in the front row. He displayed the mortgage document for the Oaks side by side with the trust amendment. The ink was dry, but the crime was still bleeding across the page. Carson pointed a laser at the signatures, explaining the microscopic shaky lines he called a tremor of hesitation. A dying woman's hand has a rhythmic inconsistency, Carson explained, his voice echoing in the silent room. This signature has the mechanical precision of a trace. In my professional opinion, these documents were signed by someone with perfect motor control, pretending to be frail. They weren't signatures, they were laborious drawings of a name. Have you ever sat through a eulogy for a life you were still very much living? I felt that same sense of displacement as Carson dismantled the forgery. He concluded by identifying a unique habitual flourish at the end of the forged E in Thorn. As Carson zoomed in on the signature, the entire courtroom could see the E, the tiny, arrogant loop that was Julian's unconscious fingerprint on his mother's death warrant. It was a flourish I had seen on 1,000 birthday cards and checks. I watched Julian's face turn a sickly shade of gray as he realized his own vanity had finally provided the evidence that his lawyers could never explain away. The forged loop of that E wasn't just a signature. It was the final gear clicking into place, revealing a mechanism of murder I had mistaken for mere misfortune. I sat in the courtroom, the image of Julian's arrogance magnified on the screen, but my mind had already fled to a steep mountain road on a humid day last June. The smell of burning brake pads seemed to fill my nostrils, cutting through the stale courtroom air. I could feel the jarring vibration of my sedan hitting the gravel ditch, the world spinning as I fought to keep the car from plummeting off the edge. At the time, Arthur, my mechanic, had looked at the severed line with a furrowed brow. "It is a miracle you are alive, Mr. Thorne," he had said. "This line didn't just snap. It looks like it was filed." I was so clouded by grief for Catherine that I had simply waved him off. "I am just an old man who cannot keep up with maintenance, Arthur. Don't overthink it." Now, staring at the cold profile of my son across the aisle, I realized Julian had insisted on taking my car for a car wash that very morning. He hadn't been cleaning the upholstery. He had been ensuring I would never come home. A second memory surfaced with the force of a physical blow. August, only 2 months later. I had been walking down the grand staircase at the Oaks when the heavy oak railing gave way. I nearly fell 20 feet to the marble floor, saved only by a desperate, panicked grab for a wall sconce. The contractor who came to fix it had been baffled. He told me the mounting screws had been removed, not just loosened. I remembered Julian being the only other person in the house that morning, supposedly checking the vents for a draft. The screws weren't loose. They were gone. Just like my son's humanity. Julian had stood at the bottom of the stairs that day, looking up at me not with relief, but with a strange clinical disappointment. "Dad, you really need to be more careful," he had said. "Maybe the house is becoming a safety hazard." I had snapped back then, telling him I had leaned on that rail for 30 years and it didn't just fall off. I realized now he was trying to gaslight me even as he tried to kill me. How many times can a child attempt to kill their father before the father stops being a parent and starts being a survivor? I glanced at the life insurance documents in my lap, looking at the double indemnity rider Julian had added with such helpful concern. The $4 million policy would have paid $8 million if I had died in an accidental car crash or a fall in my own home. $8 million for an accidental death. That was the real price tag on my soul. "You weren't trying to protect me, Julian," I thought, my heart hardening into a cold, diamond-sharp point. "You were trying to cash me in." Every witness Julian had called to testify to my unsteadiness had been there for those accidents. He wasn't just building a medical case. He was creating a corroborating narrative to ensure the insurance investigators wouldn't ask too many questions after my funeral. I realized that the slow bleed of my bank account through shell companies was only the fallback plan. The fast strike of murder had been his first choice. I looked at the judge, then back at Julian, the realization of attempted murder settling into my very bones. I gripped the armrest of my chair until the wood groaned under the pressure. The boy I had raised had spent the last year auditioning for the role of the grieving beneficiary of a tragedy he had personally authored. The bond between us was no longer just broken. It was an active crime scene, and the man sitting 10 feet away was no longer my son, but my most dangerous predator. I watched the federal agent adjust the microphone, her calm demeanor the exact opposite of the digital wildfire she was about to unleash upon my son's legal team. Agent Sarah Mitchell of the FBI, a woman whose neutral expression and tailored gray suit suggested a career spent dismantling much larger monsters than Julian, stepped up to the stand. The clinical blue light of the email headers on the screen washed over her, making her appear like a phantom of justice. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. She presented a recovered email sent from Julian to his offshore account manager in March 2022, less than 30 days after we had buried Catherine. The document outlined a cold four-phase master plan that made the courtroom fall into a stunned silence. Phase 1 was securing power of attorney under the guise of my grief. Phase 2 was the siphoning of the initial $5.7 million. Phase 3 was the usage of the Arizona rumor I had planted to trigger a controlled conservatorship. And Phase 4 was the total seizure of my $10.8 million estate. "This wasn't a medical concern, Your Honor, Agent," Mitchell said, her voice cutting through the heavy silence. "It was a business strategy with prescripted criminal milestones. How do you look at a man who spent his life analyzing risk and decide that the best use for him is collateral for your own offshore gamble?" I watched Julian's hands shake as the agent spoke, his lawyer's chair scraping harshly against the floor as he tried to formulate an objection that never came. Agent Mitchell clicked to a second email. The subject line, Marina-controlled burn. Julian had written, "Let the marina collapse. If I trigger bankruptcy before February 2026, the will clause activates, and Leo inherits everything. But if I get conservatorship first, I control the trust, and the clause dies. The bigger the disaster, the stronger my incompetence case." Judge Caldwell's face went pale. The defendant sabotaged his own business to justify this petition. Agent Mitchell nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." Then it was my turn. I took the witness stand, the dry, papery smell of the 2013 will documents a grounding presence in my hands. I needed to explain the catalyst Julian feared most, the 10-year will clause. Back in 2013, Catherine and I had added a provision stating that if Julian was ever convicted of a felony or declared bankrupt within 10 years of the first parent's death, the entire inheritance would bypass him and go directly to a trust for our grandson Leo. The clause expires February 1st, 2026. The clause was meant to protect the money from bad luck, not my own son's crimes. I testified, my voice gravely articulate and steady. Julian knew his failing marina project would soon trigger a bankruptcy, and he was racing to beat the clock. He had to declare me incompetent before the law declared him a criminal. Motive. It's the one calculation a criminal always forgets is visible to everyone else. Julian's desperation wasn't born of love, but of a countdown. My son only had to stay clean for a few more years, but his greed was so immediate and his debts so crushing that he couldn't wait. The courtroom watched as I detailed Julian's browser history recovered by Nicolette. There were hundreds of searches for how to contest a spendthrift clause and involuntary commitment loss. The marina wasn't a project, Your Honor. It was a Ponzi scheme with my name on the checkbook. He wasn't racing to save me. He was racing to beat the FBI to my bank account before the felony of his business dealings became public and triggered the forfeiture clause. I looked at Julian, and for the first time I didn't see the boy I had raised. I saw a man who had calculated the value of my life and found it less than the cost of a luxury marina slip. Judge Caldwell leaned forward, her gaze fixed on Julian with an intensity that made the air in the room feel like an icebox. "Mr. Thorne, I strongly suggest you and your counsel discuss the concept of perjury before we proceed to the final piece of evidence," she said, her voice dropping into a lethal register. The rhythmic, heavy tapping of her gavel sounded like a death knell. I stepped down from the stand, my spine straight, feeling the legal noose finally tightening around the neck of the man who thought I was too old to fight back. Robert Martinez rose to his feet for the final time, his movements possessing the grim weight of a priest administering last rites. Julian's lawyer attempted to physically block the projector, his voice rising in a desperate, high-pitched objection that Judge Caldwell silenced with a single sharp look. The final document didn't just sit on the projector. It screamed with the silent agony of a woman who had been robbed while her heart was failing. It was the Catherine Miller Educational Foundation Amendment, dated January 2022. I watched the flickering blue light of the hospice logs hit the screen, revealing a clinical timeline that made the air in the room feel thin and freezing. According to the medical logs from the care team, Catherine was in a deep, unresponsive coma on the day this document was allegedly signed. She was physically incapable of holding a glass of water, let alone a pen. Daniel Carson, the expert, returned to the stand to confirm that the signature was a clumsy trace of Julian's own habitual handwriting style. My wife was unconscious that day. I stated, my voice possessing an icy, sharp clarity that resonated through the silent hall. "Your Honor, this isn't just fraud. It is grave robbing." He wasn't holding her hand to comfort her. He was using it as a rubber stamp to steal $2.1 million intended for our grandson's future. The hospice logs revealed a detail that turned my stomach to lead. Julian had actually dismissed the night nurse for an hour to have private time with his mother. That was the window he used to perform the forgery. He wasn't just my son. He was a parasite in a tailored suit. The weight of the evidence, the Swiss bribe, the master plan email, and now this final desecration crushed Julian's last shred of composure. He surged to his feet, his face a mottled shade of crimson, the smell of fierce sweat and expensive wool radiating from him. "I did it for us," he shouted, his eyes darting frantically toward the gallery. "I did it to keep the Oaks from the creditors. The marina was supposed to save us." Bianca Thorne stood up in the gallery, her chair screeching against the marble. Her voice was a whip crack of pure disgust that silenced his rambling. "Don't you dare use my name to justify what you did to your father. Julian, she said, her hands visibly shaking as she clutched her handbag, I am done. I am completely done with you. Julian reached out a hand toward her, but she turned away, leaving him standing alone in the center of a ruin of his own making. The truth isn't just a shield, it's a scalpel. How many times had I wondered if I was the one failing him? Now I knew. The gavel didn't just sound like wood on wood, it sounded like the lid of Julian's freedom slamming shut. Judge Caldwell silences the room with a thunderous rhythmic thud of her gavel. This court will not be a tool for your larceny, Mr. Thorne, she declared, her gaze fixed on Julian with the coldness of a winter sea. She denied the conservatorship petition with prejudice, ensuring he could never weaponize the law against me again. She ordered an immediate freeze on every account associated with Julian and Bianca, and formally referred the entire case file to the U.S. Attorney's Office for Federal Prosecution, citing a predatory pattern of elder abuse and forgery. Bailiff, please ensure the petitioner does not leave the building until federal agents arrive. Then she looked at me, her expression softening by a fraction. Judge Caldwell revealed she had already signed a separate order to restore my full, unencumbered access to all Thorne accounts, effectively making Julian a beggar in the same hour he tried to be a king. As the marshals stepped into the room, their boots echoing on the marble, I looked at the brass clock on the wall and realized that for the first time in 2 years, the time finally belonged to me again. The click of the handcuffs was the most honest sound my son had made in 2 years, a sharp, metallic period at the end of a long sentence of lies. As the marshals stepped into the room, I looked at the brass clock on the wall and realized that for the first time in 2 years, the time finally belonged to me again. 2 federal marshals in tactical vests entered the well of the court, their movements practiced and efficient. They informed Julian that he was being taken into custody on federal charges of wire fraud, identity theft, and elder abuse. Julian's lawyer tried to sputter a desperate argument for bail, but the marshals cited the Swiss internment evidence as a definitive flight risk. I watched stone-faced as the boy I once shielded from every scrape was pinned against the wooden defense table. Dad, tell them. Julian screamed, his voice cracking with a terrifying realization of his own powerlessness. Robert, do something. He tried to lunge toward me one last time, his eyes wide with a manic energy. They'll come for you, Elias, he shouted, straining against the marshal's grip. The offshore people, they don't just take a loss. You have no idea what you've done. His words chilled the room, revealing that his debts were far more dangerous than mere legal fees. I didn't answer him. I couldn't. I simply watched the heavy oak doors swing shut behind him. Flash. 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 The cameras didn't want the truth. They wanted the carnage. As I exited the courtroom, flanked by Robert Martinez and Silas Pemberton, the blinding white heat of camera flashes hit me like a physical assault. The courthouse hallway was a gauntlet of microphones and shouting voices, all hungry for a soundbite about the prominent developer who had tried to bury his own father. The smell of damp limestone and ozone hung heavy in the air, the stagnant breath of a building that had seen centuries of human misery. Elias, Mr. Thorne, over here, a reporter shouted, thrusting a recorder toward my face. How does it feel to put your own son in prison? Robert Martinez stepped in front of me, his voice a shield of professional indifference. No comment, he said firmly. My client has said all he needs to say on the record. Silas, my military-grade butler, expertly cleared a path through the throng, his silent presence more effective than any shouting could be. We moved through the main hall, our footsteps echoing against the high marble ceiling, a hollow sound that matched the space where my family tree used to be. When does a victory start feeling like a funeral for the living? The question haunted me as we reached the limestone steps of the courthouse. The Charleston humidity hit me like a wet wool blanket, thick with the scent of a coming storm. Across the parking lot, I saw Julian being led out of a side exit toward a black transport van. A jacket was draped over his cuffed hands, an old trick to hide the shame, but it did nothing to hide the slump of his shoulders. For a fleeting second, our eyes met across the asphalt. There was no remorse in his gaze, no plea for forgiveness. There was only a burning, entitled rage that made me realize he didn't even see a victim in this room. He only saw an obstacle. A reporter near the steps shouted a question about Bianca, mentioning she had already released a public statement through her own attorneys. completely distancing herself and Leo from Julian's criminal enterprise. The final branch had been severed. He was truly alone. "Drive, Silas," I said as I reached the car, my voice sounding older than the stones of the courthouse. "I want to go home." Silas held the door open and I sank into the leather seat, the vibrating hum of the sedan's engine a comforting, rhythmic pulse. As Silas pulled the car away, I looked at the courthouse in the rearview mirror and saw a man in a dark suit watching us from the shadows. A man who wasn't a marshal and definitely wasn't a reporter. He stood perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the car as we joined the flow of traffic, a silent promise of a debt that hadn't been settled by the fall of a gavel. The courthouse was a theater of morality, but Robert's conference room was the morgue where the actual remains of my life's work were about to be autopsied. 3 days had passed since the marshals led my son away in iron, and the quiet, dust-moat-filled air of the office felt like a heavy shroud. I sat at the long mahogany table, listening to the rhythmic, annoying ticking of a wall clock that Robert refused to let me fix. It was out of sync, much like the reality of my bank accounts. Margaret Clark, a 45-year-old asset recovery specialist with a razor-cut bob and a reputation for finding money that had been buried in the deepest digital trenches, sat across from me. She didn't offer condolences or pleasantries. She only offered a thick binder that smelled of dry paper and cold hard facts. "Mr. Thorne, I'm not here to tell you what you want to hear," Margaret said, her voice as sharp as her hairstyle. "I'm here to tell you what's left." She opened the binder, and I was met by the blinding blue light of digital spreadsheets. It was a landscape of devastation. Margaret revealed that Julian had attempted to take out a secondary life insurance policy on me through a smaller firm only weeks before the trial began, a final, desperate bet on my mortality. The Pelican Bay Marina project had swallowed millions in a frantic Ponzi-style attempt to stay afloat. Every slipway and pier Julian had bragged about was a hole in my future. "The marina wasn't a business," Elias Robert added, leaning back in his chair. "It was a furnace fueled by your retirement. Red ink." It looked like a crime scene on the spreadsheet. Ranks of highlighted cells bled across the charts, documenting the systematic liquidation of 40 years of sweat and precision. Margaret detailed the offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands with clinical detachment. "We secured the 1.1 million with FBI cooperation," she explained, tapping a knuckle against the table. "But the 3 million in the blind trust, that's gone dark. It was moved through a series of shell companies controlled by a third party." Robert's expression darkened as he looked at me. "Julian didn't just steal it. He lost it to people who make the FBI look like choir boys. The man you saw at the courthouse, Elias. He was likely a representative of Julian's creditors. They aren't looking for a legal settlement. How do you explain to your grandson that his father traded his future for a charcoal gray Tesla?" I took a sip of the water Margaret had provided. It was bitter and cold, matching the knot of ice in my stomach. We sat in silence for a moment, the only sound the erratic pulse of that broken clock. Margaret turned to the final page of her summary, the unvarnished total of the recovery. Between the seized assets, the cars, the equity in the penthouse, the frozen offshore funds, and a settlement from the insurance fraud litigation, the numbers were finally tallied. Out of the 8.2 million Julian systematically siphoned, the recovery sat at approximately $2.1 million. 2.1 million, Margaret said, her eyes meeting mine without a hint of sugarcoating. "That's the finish line, Mr. Thorne. It's enough for a house and a grandson's education. But the Thorne legacy, he burned that to the ground." I looked at the red highlighted cells and felt a hollow, melancholy closure. I was no longer bankrupt, but the generational wealth Catherine and I had built for Leo was a ghost of its former self. A final document in the back of the binder caught my eye. It showed that Julian had listed Gregory Matthews as the secondary beneficiary on the Cayman account. My oldest friend hadn't just been a scout. He had been an heir to the theft. As Margaret closed her binder, she slid a final smaller envelope across the table, a private investigator's report on the man in the dark suit who had been following us. My fingers fumbled with the seal, the paper feeling unnaturally heavy. I realized then that the most expensive thing my son had ever bought was my absence, and the receipt was written in the blood of a family legacy that no longer existed. I sat in Robert's office, my fingers fumbling with the seal of the private investigator's report Margaret had provided. The dry adhesive resisted for a moment before giving way, revealing a dossier that unmasked the man in the dark suit. I had expected a threat, a shadow of the offshore creditors Julian feared so much. Instead, the PI report revealed that the man was an internal affairs officer from the bank, where Julian laundered the funds, but more importantly, he had been hired by Bianca's family. They had been preparing for Julian's fall, long before I ever suspected the rot, ensuring that he didn't flee with her and Leo. He's not a hitman, Elias Roberts said, leaning over my shoulder as I scanned the pages. He's a cleanup crew for the bank's reputation and a guard dog for your grandson's future. Even the shadows are just accountants now. There is no poetry left in this betrayal. A wave of melancholy relief washed over me, though it was stained by the knowledge that even the people I considered family had been keeping their own secrets behind a veil of surveillance. I drove back to the Oaks as the fading golden light of a Charleston sunset began to paint the marsh in shades of amber and copper. I passed by the local bank and the office of Gregory Matthews, seeing the familiar storefronts through a lens of absolute clarity. I no longer looked at my neighborhood as a kingdom I was defending, but as a series of structures I was merely maintaining. $6 million was a steep price for a lesson in character, even for a thorn. Yet as I pulled into my driveway, the weight on my conscience had finally lifted. Wealth is just the oil in the machine. Integrity is the steel that keeps the teeth from grinding to dust. The numbers on Margaret's spreadsheets were smaller than I had ever imagined they would be at 71, but the house was mine. The clocks were mine. And most importantly, the name was mine. I parked the car and sat in the silence for a moment, listening to the cooling engine tick in the evening air. If a man loses the world but keeps his soul, does he still need to check the balance of his checking account? Every morning I entered the house, finding it no longer felt like a besieged fortress. The air was still, but it wasn't stagnant. It was the silence of a house that had been purged. I walked directly to my study, the smell of old wood and leather-bound books, rising to meet me like an old friend. I picked up a simple brass gear, feeling its cool, smooth surface against my palm. Integrity is like a diversified portfolio. It doesn't matter how much capital you have if the fundamentals are rotten. You can't forge the passage of time, Julian. You can only waste it. I had $2.1 million left, and I knew exactly where it was going. Every cent would be dedicated to Leo's education and the preservation of this house. While I was clearing out a neglected drawer of Catherine's old sewing supplies to make room for new tools, I found a small velvet-lined box tucked behind the lining. Inside was a hidden stash of her vintage jewelry pieces Julian had missed in his frantic sweep for liquid assets. It was a literal nest egg of integrity, a gift from the past that ensured I would never have to worry about the mortgage again. I am an engineer. I repair what is broken, and I am finally whole. I picked up my reading glasses and looked at the trust documents, seeing a future that didn't require millions to be bright. Only the steady, honest ticking of a life reclaimed. The rhythmic heartbeat-like ticking of the study filled the room, a synchronized chorus of 100 small victories. A synchronized chorus of 100 small victories. The federal courtroom didn't smell like the mahogany and history of the State House. It smelled of ozone industrial floor cleaner and the cold finality of the United States versus my only son. I sat in the front row, clutching a handwritten yellow notepad until the edges were damp with my sweat. The high-pitched electronic beep of the metal detectors at the entrance still rang in my ears, a clinical herald of the security Julian had tried to bypass with his offshore shell games. Julian stood for sentencing, stripped of his Italian silk and replaced with a drab orange jumpsuit that mocked his former vanity. I watched his slumped shoulders, searching for a spark of the boy I had raised, but I found only a stranger, defeated by his own greed. The federal prosecutor didn't hold back, recapping the Pelican Bay fraud and the Swiss internment plot as a calculated attack on the financial integrity of the state. The defendant didn't just steal money, he argued, his voice echoing against the sterile walls. He attempted to delete a human being from existence. Julian's defense attorney made a desperate last-ditch effort to argue for a reduced sentence by claiming a compulsive gambling disorder. I saw Julian flinch, a visible rift opening between him and his own counsel, as he realized they were now manufacturing lies he hadn't even authorized. "I have nothing to say, Your Honor," Julian whispered when asked to speak, his gaze fixed on the industrial carpet. 22 years. That is 8,030 days of silence. Before I deliver my final words to the man who was once my child, are you still with me? Comment A, if you think 22 years is justice, or B, if you think it's too harsh. And add one short reason why. Please note the next part includes some fictionalized details, added to deepen the emotional impact and convey the core message. I walked to the lectern, the heavy clack of the bailiff's boots on the tiles sounding like a countdown. I didn't speak of the millions lost or the house Julian tried to steal. I spoke about the precision of time. I taught you how to build, Julian, I said, addressing him directly while the scratchy sound of the court reporter's machine filled the gaps in my speech. I never expected you to use those skills to dismantle your own family. I explained that while a clock can be repaired, regardless of the damage, a father's heart has no replacement parts for this level of betrayal. You bought a ticket to my exile, I told him, my voice gravely articulate and steady. But you are the one who is never coming home. Judge Marcus Vance, a man with white hair and a voice that sounded like grinding stones, leaned forward. You are a predator of the worst kind, Mr. Thorne, he said, his gaze like a physical weight in the room. You preyed upon the very love that gave you life. Justice is a heavy pendulum. It takes a long time to swing, but when it hits, it shatters everything in its path. The judge then revealed that the Swiss facility director had turned state's evidence in exchange for immunity, confirming that Julian had specifically requested accelerated cognitive decline treatments for me. The intention wasn't just to hide me. It was to destroy my mind while I was still breathing. The courtroom fell into a vacuum of horror. Sentence is set at 264 months. Judge Vance declared the sound of the gavel's report final and absolute. Remand the defendant. As the bailiffs moved in to attach the shackles, the final gear of this long, painful clock finally locked into place. Julian looked back one last time as the heavy steel doors began to close. And for the first time, I didn't see a monster or a son. I saw a man who had finally realized that his time had run out. I closed my yellow notepad, stood up, and walked toward the exit, my spine straight for the first time in years. A house only becomes a mausoleum when you stop filling it with the noise of the living, and for the first time in years, the silence at the Oaks felt temporary. I returned from the federal courthouse with the weight of the 22-year sentence still settling in my mind, a heavy pendulum finally coming to rest. My first act was to open every window, letting the salt air and the humid South Carolina breeze scour away the scent of industrial cleaner and litigation. I spent those first few days exercising the workspace meticulously, removing every trace of Julian's influence. I cleared out the hidden micro-recorder from Catherine's carriage clock, the forged documents Robert had returned, and the legal binders that had turned my sanctuary into a tactical war room. While clearing out Julian's old desk in the study, I found a letter he had written as a child, tucked behind a drawer liner. It was a crude crayon-colored note expressing a pure, simple love for the Oaks and a promise to take care of it forever. Reading it was like identifying a slow-motion structural failure of a human soul. The boy who wrote that letter had long ago been replaced by a man who saw this floorboards only as equity. I burned the letter in the fireplace, watching the blue flames consume the last of my illusions. No more secrets, I whispered to the empty study, the smell of lemon wax and fresh air finally reaching the dark corners. No more hidden gears. You would like the light in here now, Catherine. It finally reaches the places we used to hide our grief. Without the constant weight of the slow bleed hanging over me, the very air felt lighter, as if the oak walls themselves were taking a long overdue breath. The boxes were heavy. My heart was not. Leo arrived at the back gate on a Friday afternoon, the golden light of the sun catching the dust on his cardboard boxes. He didn't look like a spy this time. He looked like a young man searching for a foundation. Elias, are you sure about this? He asked, sliding a box of textbooks across the hardwood. I don't want to be a burden. Leos, you are the first thing that has made this house feel like a home since your grandmother passed. I told him, gripping his shoulder with a hand that was finally steady. You are the solution, not the problem. I helped him move into the guest wing, the very room Julian had occupied as a teenager. We were symbolically reclaiming the space for a generation that valued integrity over accumulation. Legacy isn't the money you leave behind. It's the caliber of the person who stays to finish the work. By evening, a new rhythm had established itself. I sat at the kitchen table, the warm golden light of the sunset illuminating the brass gears of a clock I was restoring. Across from me, Leo was hunched over his laptop, setting up his college study schedule. He looked up, listening to the synchronized chorus of the clocks on the wall. "That clock sounds different today, Grandpa." He noted, his eyes bright with curiosity. "Is it the mainspring?" "No. Leo," I replied, my voice reflecting a peace I hadn't known in a decade. "It is just finally in sync with the rest of the house." He smiled and told me he had officially started an internship with Robert Martinez. He wants to specialize in elder law and forensic auditing to ensure other families don't have to fight the wars we just finished. My grandson was becoming the engineer of a different kind of justice. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I saw the reflection of the brass carriage clock in the window, its hands moving toward a future that was finally ours to keep. I held the envelope with the federal return address like it was an unexploded shell, wondering if Julian was still trying to dismantle my life from behind a concrete wall. The dry, institutional feel of the prison stationery was a cold reminder of the world he now inhabited. October had brought a crispness to the Charleston air, but inside the entry hall of the Oaks, the atmosphere was finally still. I sorted through the morning mail and found 3 letters from my son, each one a phantom weight, trying to pull me back into the gears of his manipulation. I didn't need to open them to know the cadence of his voice, the entitled demands, masked as desperate pleas. Through a brief conversation with Robert, I already knew the gist. Julian was writing to request that I fund a private investigator to clear his name. Even in a cell, he saw me as nothing more than a bank account with a pulse. I stood by the mahogany table for a long time, the letters heavy in my hand. "Whatever you have to say, Julian, you should have said it when the clocks were still ticking," I whispered to the empty hallway. I walked to the attic stairs and placed the unopened envelopes into an old shoebox. I wasn't doing it out of spite. I was doing it because I finally understood that his words no longer had the power to move my gears. I'm not listening to the ghost of a predator anymore. Forgiveness isn't always about opening the door. Sometimes it's about acknowledging the lock is finally holding. Robert Martinez arrived later that afternoon carrying a leather briefcase that smelled of old parchment and fresh ink. We sat in the study, the sun setting over the oaks outside the window and casting long golden fingers across the floor. He laid out the final restructuring documents for the Thorne estate, the paperwork designed to undo every jagged tear Julian had made. We officially re-established the Catherine Miller Educational Foundation, diverting the recovered $2.1 million into a protected endowment. "It is done," Elias Roberts said, his voice carrying a rare warmth. "Every penny we pulled back is now shielding Leo and the engineering students she cared about." I signed the final page, the scratchy sound of the pen on the parchment sounding like a sigh of relief. "It feels like she is finally allowed to rest," I replied. "The ink is finally hers again." Click! The final signature, the final gear. Once Robert left, I performed a final ceremonial winding of every clock in the house. I moved from room to room, the rhythmic metallic thwack of the winding key, a heartbeat returning to a body that had been cold for too long. I ended in the study with the brass carriage clock. I looked at a photo of Catherine on the mantel and felt a profound sense of completion. The 1K7 project had started as a desperate attempt to save my home, but it had ended as a mission to save a soul. We kept the house. Catherine and I murmured the multi-layered resonance of the clocks, striking the hour, filling the space with a perfect, synchronized chorus. And we kept the truth. The gears are clean now. I found a small handwritten note from her tucked inside the original trust document that Julian had somehow missed. In his greed, a simple "I trust you" scrawled in her elegant hand. It validated every risk, every cold calculation, and every moment of feigned frailty. I am an engineer, and I have finally repaired the one thing that mattered most. I set the key down next to the carriage clock, the house filled with a perfect synchronized chorus of ticking that sounded like 1,000 tiny hearts beating in the dark. I replaced the heavy legal files on my desk with a single blank ledger, the paper white and expectant as a fresh Charleston snow. The transition from the chaos of the last 2 years to the structured peace of the present was a recalibration I performed every single morning. I sat in my study, the air smelling of old oak and the fresh, sharp scent of ink, while the spring sun of 2025 warmed my hands. The house felt lighter, the shadows having retreated to make way for a different kind of occupant. I heard the frantic, joyful scuffle of sneakers on the hardwood before the door burst open. Leo burst into the kitchen, his face flushed, with an intensity I hadn't seen since before Catherine passed. He was waving a thick envelope from the University of Colorado, Boulder. "I'm in, Grandpa. Boulder. Engineering," he shouted the words, carrying a resonance that made the crystal in the cabinet hum. We stood in the kitchen, the very room where I had once feigned confusion to trap a thief, and celebrated a victory that had nothing to do with litigation. The Catherine Miller Educational Foundation. The fund my own son had tried to erase from existence was paying for Leo's first year. By saving those millions, I hadn't just preserved a pile of cash. I had ensured that the Thorne legacy would finally be built on merit rather than manipulation. Your grandmother's dream is finally taking its first step. "Leo," I said, my voice thick with a pride that didn't need to be suppressed. I watched him spread out the acceptance packet on the counter, and I noticed a separate letter regarding a merit scholarship named after an anonymous donor. As I read the fine print, I realized the donor was the very bank Julian had tried to defraud. They were so impressed by the evidence of my integrity during the trial that they had funded a new chair in my honor. After the celebration, I retreated back to the sanctuary of my study. A new stack of mail sat on the desk, but these weren't from the federal prison or offshore creditors. They were letters from other seniors, men and women who had heard my story and were now finding the courage to look at the cracks in their own family structures. Inspired by our victory, Robert Martinez and I had begun a volunteer advocacy group for victims of elder financial abuse. I began organizing my notes for an upcoming seminar, realizing that my experience as an engineer gave me a unique perspective on the mechanism of fraud. "If you can read the numbers, you can spot the fraud before the account collapses," I muttered to myself. "I'm not just a survivor. I'm a blueprint for the next one." I opened a drawer to find a fresh pen, and my eyes fell on an old silver-frame photo of Julian at Leo's age. He was smiling, his eyes bright, with a potential that had eventually been hollowed out by entitlement. Integrity isn't a state of being, it's a constant recalibration. I realized then that I wasn't looking for a son anymore, nor was I mourning the one I lost. My focus was entirely on the boy in the other room, ensuring Leo never felt the same crushing pressure to be perfect that had eventually corrupted Julian's soul. I wanted him to be an engineer of truth, not a builder of facades. The distant, steady ticking of the house's 100 clocks provided a rhythmic backbeat to my thoughts, a synchronized heartbeat that signaled the Thorne name was finally clean. I reached for the new leather-bound journal on my desk, the crisp snap of it opening, sounding like a final gavel strike. I uncapped my pen and touched the nib to the first page, knowing exactly how this new story would begin. This time I wasn't writing a defense or a tactical plan for a war. I was writing a legacy that wouldn't be measured in bank balances, but in the precision of the lives we built from the ruins. I spent 40 years ensuring that gears moved in perfect harmony, but watching Silas hang up his uniform was the first time I felt the true weight of a well-oiled life reaching its natural conclusion. The June morning air was thick with the scent of early summer jasmine, filtering through the entry hall of the Oaks, as I stood before the man who had been my shadow and my shield for decades. Silas Pemberton was no longer the military-grade butler I had once hired. He was a friend whose loyalty had outlasted every storm. I looked at his empty coat hook in the mudroom, a small but jarring gap in the architecture of my daily life. In my hands, I held the brass carriage clock. It was the same gift Catherine had given me, the one Julian had desecrated with his greed. But I had spent months stripping it down to the last screw, cleansing it of its dark history. "It's kept good time for us, Silas," I said, my voice thick with a poignant respect. "Let it keep good time for you now." Silas accepted the clock, the heavy, comforting tick resonating between us like a shared heartbeat. He gave me a rare, emotional nod, his eyes misty. "It has been the honor of my life to stand by this house, Mr. Thorne," he replied. Before he stepped toward the door, he reached into his breast pocket and produced a small leather-bound notebook. "I started this years ago, sir," he admitted, handing it to me, a private log of Julian's suspicious visitors. "I wanted to ensure no loose ends ever haunt this estate again." It was his final gift, a tactical insurance policy for the peace we had fought so hard to reclaim. By that evening, the heavy silence of Silas's departure was replaced by the vibrant energy of Leo's 18th birthday. The dining room was flooded with golden early summer light, the table spread with the smell of celebratory birthday candles and old paper. I watched Leo sitting there, his face glowing with a potential that hadn't been hollowed out by entitlement. I realized then that my grandson had made a choice that defined the end of our war. He had kept Julian's former wing exactly as it was now, a library, refusing to let the space return to what it had been. He was breaking the cycle of ghosts. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out the legal documents for the secondary trust. The smooth, cool feel of the parchment was a grounding sensation as I laid the $2.1 million of recovered wealth before him. This isn't just an inheritance, Leo, I told him, making sure he saw the steady clarity in my eyes. It is a second chance for our name. I didn't just hand him a check. I handed him the story of how that money was clawed back from the brink of oblivion. I explained that wealth is only a tool, one that becomes a weapon in the hands of the entitled, but a foundation in the hands of the principled. 18 years of waiting, 1 second of signing, a lifetime of change. Leo looked at the documents, then at me, his expression shifting from boyish excitement to the solemn weight of an engineer accepting a critical blueprint. "I won't waste it, Grandpa," he promised, his voice carrying the same graveside resonance I had once feared I'd lose. "I know what it cost you to keep it." I watched him sign his name, his hand moving with a fluid, honest motion that lacked any of his father's habitual flourishes. As Leo tucked the trust documents into his bag, I saw the reflection of the sunrise in the polished wood of the table, a clean, bright line that moved steadily forward, leaving the shadows of the past exactly where they belonged. The gears were finally in sync, the timing was perfect, and for the first time since Catherine died, I felt the mainspring of my soul relax into a state of absolute equilibrium. A house doesn't breathe through its vents or its chimney. It breathes through the people who walk through its doors. And today, the Oaks was preparing for its most important exhale. The sound of the front gate clicking shut behind Silas Pemberton for the last time had signaled the end of one era, but the crisp morning air of mid-January 2025 carried the scent of a new one. I walked out to the porch and found a single envelope in the mailbox. It bore an Oregon postmark, the paper smelling faintly of pine and the crispness of the Pacific Northwest. I sat on the porch swing, the chain groaning rhythmically as I opened the letter from Bianca. She wrote of a quiet life in a small town far from the gilded cages of Charleston. "I hope you can forgive me for the things I didn't say, Elias." The ink blurred slightly as if by a stray drop of moisture. "Oregon is a long way from Charleston, but it's close enough for a fresh start." In a startling moment of honesty, she revealed that she had used her remaining personal savings funds she had hidden, even from Julian, to anonymously pay back the small vendors and local creditors Julian had burned during the marina collapse. It was a quiet, desperate restitution that spoke more of her character than any legal defense ever could. She mentioned that Leo had visited her, and while the wounds were deep, the silence between them was finally beginning to heal into a distant civil peace. I looked out over the Charleston marshes, the silence no longer feeling like a tomb, but like an anticipatory quiet. The driveway was soon cluttered with the signs of a life in transition. Bins of clothes, a guitar case, and the heavy engineering textbooks I had bought for Leo were piled near his car. He had finished his fall semester early through advanced credits and was eager to start Boulder's spring term ahead of the traditional schedule. I held one of the volumes in my hands, the weight of the knowledge inside feeling like an anchor for his future. We shared a quiet moment by the trunk, the golden winter sun glinting off the rear window. I reached into my pocket and gave him a small leather-bound notebook of his own, identical to the ones I used for my investment logs. "Don't just study the numbers, Leo," I told him, my voice steady and wise. "Study the people behind them. Integrity isn't just for portfolios. It is for the men who build them." He took the notebook with a solemnity that made me realize he wasn't just my grandson anymore. He was the new steward of our integrity. "I'll call you when I hit the state line, Grandpa," he promised, his eyes lingering on the front door of the house. "I promise." Watching him leave was like closing a balanced ledger. The work was done, but the legacy was just beginning. I stood on the gravel as he backed out, and as he turned the wheel, I noticed his license plate frame was from the local shop where I had taken my car after the brake failure. It was a subtle, wordless nod, a confirmation that he knew exactly what we had both survived and that he carried that survival with him. The taillights disappeared down the long oak-lined driveway, leaving me in a silence that was finally my own. I looked at the house, its white pillars standing tall against the encroaching dusk. Legacy isn't the money you leave behind, it's the caliber of the person who stays to finish the work. I had lost a son to the rod of greed, but I had gained a future built on the hard-won steel of truth. I stood alone on the gravel, the dust from his tires settling back into the earth, and realized that for the first time in my life, I wasn't calculating risk, I was simply accepting peace. The shadows of the past had finally found their place in the dark, leaving the porch light as a beacon for whatever time I had left. I turned and walked toward the front door, the weight of the world no longer pressing against my spine. I used to think the purpose of time was to remind us it's running out, but as I watched the frost melt off the garden, I realized it's actually there to prove that every second is a chance to start again. The sound of the front door latching shut behind the last of my legal guests months ago had left a silence that was once a vacuum, but now it was a sanctuary. I stood at the tall study window as the first light of a late January morning in 2026 touched the garden, the air smelling of cold, crisp, melting frost. The calendar on my desk read January 28th. But the unusually mild winter had coaxed the first signs of spring ahead of schedule. Amidst the gray mulch and winter-worn soil, I spotted a vibrant, shocking purple. It was a single crocus breaking through the earth with a quiet, stubborn strength. "You are early this year, little one," I whispered, the glass cooling my forehead as I leaned in. This was the first sign of life in the garden since Catherine's passing that didn't feel like a heavy reminder of loss, but rather a declaration of endurance. My own life had survived the deep freeze of a son's betrayal and emerged with its core intact. I noticed the crocus was growing exactly where Catherine and I had buried a small metal time capsule 40 years ago, a box filled with Polaroid photos and a list of dreams we've mostly achieved. It was a reminder that the most valuable things are often the ones we forget we already have until the ground thaws. The structure held. The foundation is still here. I looked down at my hands, no longer trembling with the phantom weight of Julian's greed. I realized I hadn't checked my bank balance in 3 months, the ultimate proof that Julian's primary weapon, financial terror, had lost all its edge. He had tried to starve me out, but I had found a way to thrive on the simple clarity of the truth. A heart isn't a vault for gold. It's the engine that keeps the soul in motion. As long as the fundamentals are sound, the returns follow. The house around me was silent, yet full, a balanced portfolio that no longer required my constant rebalancing to stay healthy. The morning sun began warming the back of my neck, a gentle golden pressure that felt like a hand resting on my shoulder. I stood in the absolute peaceful stillness of the study listening. Then the hour struck. I heard the grandfather clock in the hall and the carriage clock on the mantel strike in a perfect resonant unison I had spent a lifetime seeking. There was no lag, no friction, no mechanical disagreement. It was a single pure note that echoed through the rooms Catherine and I had built together. It's okay to just listen now, I thought, finally, letting go of the need to monitor the markets or anticipate the next downturn. Time isn't a debt anymore. It's a gift. The ticking wasn't a countdown to an end. It was the heartbeat of a home that was finally, truly free. I watched the golden light stretch across the floorboards, illuminating the dust motes and the polished wood, and I felt a transcendental fulfillment that had nothing to do with bank balances or legacies. I had fought a war for my own existence, and I had won more than just a house or a trust fund. I had won the right to sit in the quiet without fear. I took a deep breath of the cool morning air, tasting the scent of a world waking up, and realized that my own spring had arrived long after I thought the winter would never end. I turned away from the window, the narrative of 1K7 coming to a rest as the clocks achieved their final, perfect synchronization. I left the window open, a small invitation to the world outside, and stepped back into the house, leaving the ghosts where they belonged in the history books. I took a deep breath of the cool morning air and turned back toward the house, leaving the window open so I could hear the world waking up one steady tick at a time. Looking back at this bitter journey, I realized that this tragedy was not just the loss of money, but the collapse of blind faith. Do not be like me. Do not let parental love cloud the vigilance necessary against greed. Family betrayal is a type of pain that can dismantle even the sturdiest foundations if we lack clarity. The greatest lesson from my family story is that kindness without boundaries only invites darkness to grow. I believe the ultimate revelation of the truth was guided by God's will, helping me preserve a flicker of light for Leo's future. This is not merely a family story of resentment, but a warning about protecting your legacy and self-respect. I hope that through this family story, you learn to trust, but always verify. Do not let family betrayal be the end of your life. Turn it into the strength to be reborn, as I did. The truth of this family betrayal, however agonizing, was what finally set me free. Thank you for sticking with me until the very end of this journey. Please share your thoughts in the comments. What would you do if you were in my shoes facing such a cold-blooded scheme from your own child? I truly value your perspective. If this narrative touched your heart, consider subscribing so you won't miss our upcoming stories. A quick reminder, while inspired by real-life cases of elder financial abuse, certain elements have been dramatized for storytelling purposes. If this particular theme isn't to your taste, feel free to explore other content on the channel that might suit you.